A world on fire rarely notices the second match until it's too late. Welcome to What If Horizons, where we explore the moments that haven't happened yet, but could change everything if they do. I'm your host, and today we ask a question so plausible it feels like it's already halfway answered. What if China seizes Taiwan while the Middle East burns? Right now, most eyes are fixed on the inferno unfolding between Israel and Iran. Rockets, retaliations, back-channel diplomacy in Geneva, U.S. warships inching closer to the Gulf. News cycles are flooded with Middle East headlines, rightfully so. But history doesn't wait for one war to end before starting another. And Beijing knows that. Imagine a war room somewhere deep inside Zhongnanhai. Maps of Taiwan lit up in red. Naval fleets on standby in the Taiwan Strait. Satellite images streaming in, algorithms calculating risk tolerance, and one dominant assessment rising to the surface. The world is distracted. The United States is overextended. If not now, then when? This is not speculation from the fringe. In recent days, China has sharply increased its military pressure on Taiwan, dispatching dozens of warplanes in breach of Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, launching joint naval drills east of the island, and making logistical moves that analysts say could easily double as staging grounds. In the fog of geopolitical war, one pattern is emerging: pressure, normalize, escalate, then act. What makes this moment uniquely volatile isn't just that China might be tempted. It's that the entire international system is busy managing a different fire. With the United States diplomatically and potentially militarily entangled in the Middle East, its ability to project immediate, coordinated power in the Indo-Pacific becomes strained. European allies, already split over Israel's actions and Iran's threats, are in no shape to open another front. And the United Nations, paralyzed by its own structure, has become more stage than solution. But that's exactly what makes the Taiwan scenario not only dangerous, but strategically logical, at least from China's perspective. A Middle East on fire provides ideal global conditions for an audacious move in East Asia. One regional crisis offers cover for another. And in that moment of distraction, China could cross a line the world has long believed it wouldn't dare to. So what happens if they do? In the next parts of this episode, we'll trace how such a scenario could unfold, from the first missiles to the last diplomatic options. We'll examine the military calculus, the economic shockwaves, the diplomatic paralysis, and what it means for the future of global order. Because when two theaters of war stretch global attention, alliances, and leadership to their limits, it's not just the soldiers on the front lines who pay the price. It's everyone. Let's go deeper. To understand how this scenario could unfold, we have to start with the context that already exists: the military postures, the diplomatic noises, the simmering ambitions that only need one global distraction to boil over. In the past 2 weeks, China's movements around Taiwan have shifted from routine pressure to something far more coordinated. Satellite images show massive mobilization, warships moving through the Taiwan Strait, fighter jets breaching air defense zones in tight formations, and military exercises rehearsing amphibious landings. Officially, they're defensive drills. Unofficially, they look suspiciously like the early stages of a full-scale operational rehearsal. President Xi Jinping has been vocal about two things: the need for global de-escalation, particularly in the Middle East, and the historical mission of reunifying Taiwan with the mainland. He speaks of peace while building capacity for war, and that ambiguity is strategic. Xi doesn't need to declare war. He needs only to wait until the rest of the world is too distracted, too tired, or too overwhelmed to push back. While the United States scrambles to manage a deteriorating ceasefire in the Middle East, its attention is divided. Intelligence bandwidth is thin. Military resources are repositioning. U.S. carrier groups are rotating toward the Gulf, not the Pacific. And even though President Biden, or Trump, depending on who is in office, has reaffirmed support for Taiwan, the credibility of deterrence depends not on words, but on presence. Analysts across Washington and Tokyo are sounding the alarm. A leaked war game scenario from the RAND Corporation suggested that if China launched a surprise operation under the cover of a Middle East crisis, Allied responses would be sluggish at best. Japan and Australia, two key U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific, would hesitate to act decisively if they feared simultaneous retaliation from Chinese cyber attacks or economic pressure. And in the fog of global tension, hesitation is fatal. Beijing understands this perfectly. The timing isn't accidental. The world's current chaos is not a deterrent to China, it's an opportunity. Beijing doesn't need the world to approve of its actions. It needs the world to be unable to respond fast enough to stop them. Meanwhile, Taiwan's situation grows more precarious. Internally, their government is under pressure from both hawkish defense voices and a civilian population weary of endless threats. Every new Chinese drill forces a political choice: escalate and prepare, or wait and hope. Both come with risks. And as the Israeli-Iranian conflict consumes media bandwidth, Taiwan's warnings begin to fade into the background noise. All it takes now is a spark. And China, watching global leaders play whack-a-mole with crises, may already have its hand on the match. Coming up next, what does that first move look like? How might China actually launch a sudden military operation while the world is focused on another war? Let's walk through the opening moves of the scenario no one wants, but too few are preparing to stop. So let's imagine the moment the curtain lifts. It begins not with a declaration, but with silence. Radar systems in Taipei flicker as unusual jamming pulses ripple through the electromagnetic spectrum. Taiwanese civilian satellites lose contact for just long enough to create doubt. Simultaneously, commercial internet in key regions begins to lag, then fails. Somewhere between routine and irregular, Taiwan starts to lose its digital breath. Then the sky darkens. China's opening move is not a slow crawl, but a synchronized sprint. Ballistic missiles strike predetermined military targets across Taiwan: airfields, radar stations, naval bases. Precision strikes, but still brutal. Chinese cyber units flood Taiwan's command and control networks with denial-of-service attacks. Government websites go black. ATMs glitch. Power flickers. At the same time, the People's Liberation Army Navy executes a naval encirclement, deploying destroyers, corvettes, and amphibious ships in a ring around the island. The goal is not just to blockade, but to choke, militarily, economically, and psychologically. The world calls it a siege. Beijing calls it a policing action. Then comes the layered assault, what some analysts have called the cabbage strategy. Waves of non-military vessels, fishing boats, Coast Guard cutters, merchant ships swarm the waters around Taiwan, their sheer volume designed to obscure true military movements. Hidden among them, landing ships, drones, submarines. The line between civilian and military blurs intentionally. China also targets the small outlying islands of Kinmen and Matsu, Taiwanese territories just a few kilometers off China's coast. They're easy to seize, symbolically powerful, and hard to retake. Their capture sends a message. The operation has begun, and it is real. All of this unfolds within 24 to 36 hours. The world is still watching airstrikes between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. CNN is split-screening missile interceptions in Tel Aviv. The U.S. president is either asleep, mid-briefing, or flying across time zones for an emergency G7 meeting about Iran. And in that brief window of global preoccupation, China may achieve its first objective: irreversible escalation. Taiwan, of course, does not sit still. Their response is fast and ferocious. The island activates its porcupine strategy. Dispersed mobile missile units take to highways and underground bunkers. Drones swarm to intercept Chinese aircraft. Civil defense networks go into high gear. But the imbalance of scale is immense. China's advantage is not only military, it's psychological. The gambit here is shock. Hit hard enough, fast enough, while the world is looking elsewhere, and by the time anyone gets their act together, the new status quo is already on the map. The global question isn't just will the US respond, but how fast can they, and what will it cost? That's what we explore next. In next part, we unpack the military and strategic implications of this sudden move, the potential involvement of US forces, the role of Japan, the costs of intervention, and why even a successful defense of Taiwan could come at an unimaginable price. Stay with us. If China strikes Taiwan while the Middle East is still unraveling, the response isn't just a matter of principle. It's a logistical and strategic nightmare. For the United States and its allies, it would mean opening a second front while the first one is still actively flaring. And second fronts have a nasty habit of becoming lost causes if the first is never resolved. Let's start with the military math. Taiwan is not defenseless. Its entire doctrine is built on survival, not domination. The so-called porcupine strategy means turning the island into a spike-laden hell for any invader. Mobile missile launchers, coastal anti-ship batteries, anti-air systems hidden in tunnels, underground air bases with rotating runways. Taiwan's defense is designed to absorb and delay. Every hour gained is one more hour for help to arrive. But the help needs to be ready. U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific are substantial but stretched. Guam is fortified, Okinawa has assets, and carrier strike groups routinely sail the region. But in a two-front crisis, Middle East and Taiwan, the Pentagon has to choose where to prioritize. Mobilizing for Taiwan may require repositioning naval assets already tasked with containing Iran. In this moment, strategic deterrence collides with regional trade-off. Still, a Chinese invasion would not go unanswered. The U.S. would likely activate its closest regional allies, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and possibly India in a limited supportive role. Japan's involvement would be monumental. For decades, it has walked a fine line on Taiwan, but with missiles flying and sea lanes choked, Tokyo would be forced to act. Japanese Aegis destroyers and air bases would become forward staging points for missile defense and logistics. Australia, through AUKUS, would provide support, submarines, intelligence, and perhaps cyber capabilities. This combined force would attempt to blunt China's offensive, sinking transport ships, intercepting missile waves, securing shipping routes, and keeping Taiwan supplied. But that's where the costs spiral. Simulations and war games paint a grim picture. RAND simulations show the U.S. and its allies losing dozens of warships and potentially thousands of personnel within weeks. The cost of holding Taiwan, especially if China goes all in, would rival that of the opening phases of World War II. Even if the U.S. and its allies succeed in halting a full invasion, the damage would be catastrophic. Ports bombed, cities flattened, sea routes shut down, and possibly the loss of one or more U.S. aircraft carriers. In this scenario, there is no decisive victory. At best, there's a bloody stalemate. Taiwan remains standing, but scarred. China is repelled, but not broken. And the world, watching from behind crumbling institutions, is forced to redefine what counts as deterrence in a world with no dominant superpower. Now consider what happens beyond the battlefield. The economic, diplomatic, and psychological shockwaves of this conflict would radiate far beyond East Asia. Up next, we shift our focus to the rest of the world. How markets react, how governments scramble, and how the crisis in the Taiwan Strait would ricochet through an already inflamed global order. Let's continue. The moment the first Chinese missiles hit Taiwanese soil, the tremors aren't limited to the island or even the region. They ripple across the global system like an earthquake, splitting fault lines from Shanghai to San Francisco, from Berlin to Buenos Aires. Within hours, global stock markets plunge. The Nasdaq and Nikkei both suffer immediate double-digit losses. Taiwan is a global tech linchpin. Its semiconductor manufacturing alone powers everything from smartphones to satellites. With factories threatened or offline, panic spreads across the supply chain. CEOs from Apple, Nvidia, and Samsung are on emergency calls with defense analysts, not just logistics coordinators. The world realizes it's not just a war over land, it's a war over chips. Shipping routes in the South China Sea grind to a halt. Insurance premiums skyrocket. Oil tankers reroute. Supply chains rupture. The ripple becomes a cascade. Inflation spikes. Interest rates wobble. Currencies from emerging markets freefall. It's a new kind of economic crisis. Neither recession nor stagflation, but something nastier, strategic fragmentation. The globalized economy begins to decouple in real time, with borders drawn not by geography, but by which side of the Taiwan question you fall on. The U.S., of course, responds with sanctions. Massive, sweeping, and immediate. Chinese banks are frozen out of SWIFT. Export licenses for microchips and rare earth elements are suspended. Europe follows, but not unanimously. Germany, facing an energy crunch, hesitates. France pushes for mediation. Hungary blames the US for provoking China. The EU fractures on impact. In Beijing, Xi Jinping doesn't flinch. Sanctions were expected, priced in, planned for. China had already begun de-dollarizing, stockpiling reserves, and building alternative financial networks with Russia, Iran, and the BRICS bloc. Beijing frames the conflict as an internal affair, claiming Taiwan as a rebellious province and accusing the West of neo-imperial meddling. Domestically, nationalism surges. Even those who privately opposed escalation dare not speak against the party line. At the United Nations, the Security Council becomes a theater of paralysis. Russia backs China. The US calls for condemnation. Vetoes fly. No resolution passes. In the General Assembly, smaller nations walk a diplomatic tightrope, fearful of economic retaliation from China, yet uneasy about the precedent of forceful annexation. Meanwhile, back in the Middle East, the fire is still burning. Iran continues missile strikes into northern Israel. Saudi Arabia, once cautiously neutral, increases oil production to gain leverage over Western allies. The world is now juggling two spiraling crises, and no one has enough hands. The most alarming development, however, comes not from the battlefield or the trading floor, but from the map of global alliances. The world begins to split, not neatly into Cold War blocs, but into unstable, transactional networks. Brazil hedges. Turkey plays both sides. India sells arms to one and signs trade deals with the other. This is the new world disorder, fluid, chaotic, and bristling with risk. And yet, it's still just beginning. Coming up next, we examine the next phase. What happens if the world stays distracted too long? If the Middle East burns while China solidifies gains in Taiwan, do we face a future where power no longer cares about legitimacy, but only momentum? Let's keep going. Time is a weapon. And in this two-front crisis, it's the one Beijing wields best. As Israel and Iran remain locked in tit-for-tat escalation, missiles flying, militias activated, and Gulf states cautiously hedging, the West bandwidth is already stretched to the breaking point. Geneva peace talks flounder, and diplomatic oxygen is consumed by trying to prevent the Middle East from igniting into a regional war. But while that fire rages, something far more calculated is happening in the Pacific: consolidation. By the time the international community shifts its gaze back toward Taiwan, much of the situation on the ground, and in the water, has changed. China hasn't completed a full-scale invasion, not yet, but it's already achieved something more subtle and possibly more enduring: control without total conquest. Key islands, Kinmen, Matsu, remain in PLA hands. Taiwan's ports are under quasi-blockade, patrolled by an ever-growing web of Chinese Coast Guard and naval presence. Flights are rerouted or grounded. Internet connections are unstable, and foreign journalists report being blocked from accessing large portions of the island. It's not occupation in the traditional sense. It's an external stranglehold under the pretense of a security perimeter. Meanwhile, Taiwan's economy bleeds. Export contracts are frozen. Tech supply chains unravel. Foreign investors pull out. The Taiwanese public, resilient but exhausted, starts to feel the psychological toll of a semi-siege. Some citizens call for international intervention. Others begin to whisper about terms for autonomy under Chinese oversight, not out of loyalty, but fatigue. And here's where timing is everything. The United States, having scrambled to rebalance its focus, finds itself caught between two losing games: the brutal slog of Israeli-Iranian conflict on one hand, and the creeping paralysis in the Taiwan Strait on the other. Congress debates emergency appropriations. Military leaders request redeployments. National Security Council meetings stack into the early morning hours. But every response feels one step too late. In Tokyo and Canberra, alarm bells ring louder. Japan, which had promised only logistical support, now considers direct military action to preserve sea lane security. Australia warns that China's expansion in the Pacific may not stop at Taiwan. The Philippines offers U.S. basing rights, provoking Chinese fury. Southeast Asia, long caught between trade dependence on China and defense ties to the U.S., begins fracturing along fault lines that had previously been buried beneath polite diplomacy. Europe, still absorbing refugee flows from the Middle East and grappling with an energy crunch, looks east and sees too many problems, too few options. Some leaders call for a Pacific NATO. Others urge restraint. Many simply plead for a ceasefire in either war zone, if only to catch a breath. The global system, built on the illusion that major wars could be managed one at a time, is now stretched past its capacity to function. There's no bandwidth left for global governance. Only reaction, reallocation, and reckoning. In this moment, China doesn't need to win a war. It only needs to hold its ground long enough for the world to normalize what was once unthinkable. Coming up next, the real what-if moment. What happens when two wars tip the balance of global power and neither ends cleanly? Are we entering an era where conflict is constant, diplomacy is performative, and world order is just a memory? Let's explore. What if this is the moment we stop calling it a crisis and start calling it the new normal? Two major conflicts unfolding in parallel. Neither resolved, neither ignored. The Middle East continues to erupt. Israeli warplanes strike Iranian targets with increasing frequency, while Hezbollah and the Houthis expand their own theaters of fire. U.S. forces scramble to contain the fallout while avoiding full-scale entanglement. The Geneva process is on life support, choked by competing agendas and spoiled by missile fire hours after every ceasefire proposal is signed. And yet, in the Pacific, the tempo of tension is different, less violent perhaps, but far more strategic. China, now entrenched around Taiwan's periphery, does not rush the clock. It doesn't have to. The longer this slow-burn siege continues, the more it chips away at international resolve. Every delay in response, every meeting that gets postponed, every convoy that arrives a day too late becomes another data point in China's favor. The world, in effect, is being tested, not in a single decisive moment, but in its attention span, its willingness to absorb simultaneous shocks, and its capacity to adapt. This is the moment the balance of power tips, not through conquest, but attrition. Washington may have the firepower, but Beijing has the tempo. It has designed its actions not to provoke a decisive U.S. retaliation, but to force a dozen small dilemmas. Respond here or there. Protect Taiwan's undersea cables or deter Iran's proxies in Lebanon. Maintain a naval presence in the Strait of Hormuz or double down in the Philippine Sea. The global policeman now has too many alarms going off and only one pair of hands. Allies begin to question reliability. Some double down, like Japan and the UK, who see the chaos as a signal to reinforce military spending and strategic posture. Others retreat into silence, fearful of Chinese trade punishment or Russian opportunism. In Africa and Latin America, leaders ask a different question entirely. What happens to us in a world where no one is looking our way anymore? This is the real what if, not just what if China seizes Taiwan, but what if the world accepts it, gradually, not through consent, but through exhaustion? And what happens if both these conflicts, Middle East and Pacific, drag on not for weeks, but for years? Wars that start sharp often end blurry. What if neither side wins decisively, and we enter an era of open-ended strategic competition, where ceasefires become a kind of punctuation, not a period? In this scenario, peace isn't restored. It's just paused. We'll continue this exploration, where we look at the final costs, the global reordering of power, trust, and economy, and ask, is this the descent into a multipolar world where strength replaces legitimacy and speed replaces law? Or is there still a narrow window for diplomacy to catch up before history locks us in? Let's keep going. So, what if this is the turning point? Not into open global warfare, but into something colder, more permanent, and far more difficult to reverse. Because what's emerging now isn't World War III in the traditional sense. It's not trench warfare, not nuclear standoffs with fingers hovering over red buttons. It's a fragmented, asymmetric conflict, regional wars igniting under the shadow of a collapsing global order. It's a transition from a world shaped by institutions to a world shaped by momentum. As the Middle East burns and Taiwan remains encircled, something more profound is shifting. Trust. Trust between allies. Trust in deterrence. Trust in rules. Once eroded, that trust is harder to rebuild than any airbase, aircraft carrier, or alliance treaty. In Washington, lawmakers once certain of American military preeminence now ask quieter questions. Can the U.S. sustain two simultaneous deterrence campaigns, one in the Pacific, one in the Levant, without weakening both? Is the current force posture even suited for this kind of warfare, where conflicts start with drones, proxies, and cyber disruption rather than declarations and tanks? In Europe, the realization is sinking in. Collective security depends not just on NATO's Article 5, but on political will to invoke it in crises that blur the old geography. What if Lithuania is threatened while the South China Sea explodes? What if Russian forces probe borders while American battle groups are tied up in the Gulf and the Pacific? What if all for one becomes all, but not all at once? In Asia, the emerging blocs begin to solidify. China builds a belt of compliance, not only through military intimidation, but through economic entanglement. Smaller nations like Cambodia, Myanmar, even parts of the Pacific Islands begin to echo Beijing's language. Internal affairs, sovereign reunification, external interference. Taiwan, once a symbol of democratic resilience, is now being cast as a provocation by design. Meanwhile, the economies of the world realign. Sanctions regimes have created bifurcated systems. Western firms decouple from Chinese markets. Chinese firms embrace parallel alternatives. Technology splinters. Trade corridors shift. The internet itself begins to fracture, firewalled blocks emerging with their own rules, their own facts, and their own geopolitical narratives. And for the average citizen, the effects are felt in subtler ways. Prices rise. Shortages creep in. Travel becomes complicated. Access to goods once taken for granted, semiconductors, fertilizers, energy, even information, becomes politicized. War is no longer something that happens over there. It comes through the supply chain, through inflation, through the newsfeed algorithm, through the disinformation you can't quite prove is fake. All of this, happening not with one explosion, but with 1,000 pressure points tightening month after month. So what if we're not facing the beginning of a world war, but the end of the post-war world? Next, we'll reflect on the bigger question. If this really is the moment where diplomacy failed, what lessons are we carrying forward into the next era of geopolitics? Or have we already passed the point where lessons even matter? Stay with us. Here's the moment we stop asking, what if, like it's a future scenario, and start realizing it may already be our present. The dominoes didn't fall in one great push. They were nudged, one by one, over years. But the result is the same. A world where the architecture of peace is cracking and nobody seems able or willing to rebuild it. Let's look at what that really means. First, diplomacy. The Geneva talks, the UN Security Council, the G7, ASEAN, even back channels in Oman or Vienna, all strained, stalled, or symbolic. We have the trappings of diplomacy without traction. Ceasefires are paper promises, negotiations are PR events. The world's conflict resolution toolkit was designed for fewer fires, smaller rooms, and slower escalation. It can't keep up with a world where actors are playing a faster, more ruthless game. Second, deterrence. The old logic said if you strike, we strike harder, and no one wins. But deterrence only works when the stakes are clear and the players are rational in the same way. Today, China doesn't need to win a war over Taiwan in the traditional sense. It only needs to change the status quo and make it stick. Iran doesn't need to destroy Israel. It only needs to raise the cost of Israeli security so high that regional paralysis sets in. These are not total wars. They are permanent negotiations by fire. Third, narrative. In this new landscape, power isn't just about missiles or markets. It's about who controls the frame. China calls its siege of Taiwan a stabilization mission. Iran calls its attacks defense of sovereignty. The US calls its deployments containment. The lines are so blurred that international law, the moral compass we once claimed to share, begins to spin wildly. And when every actor frames aggression as preemption, every audience is left guessing who to believe. And so we return to the listener, to you. Because in this moment, the world doesn't just fracture between East and West. It fractures between cynicism and urgency, between people who say, this is inevitable, and people who still ask, what can be done? If diplomacy has failed, the lesson isn't that it was worthless. It's that it wasn't fast enough, bold enough, or brave enough to meet the crisis before it arrived. So here we are, on one side, the Middle East, an ancient land with modern weapons, locked in a cycle of retaliation that leaves cities smoldering and diplomats gasping for relevance. On the other, Taiwan, a tiny island holding back the tide of regional dominance, caught in a geopolitical chokehold while the world debates spreadsheets and red lines. And in the middle, the rest of us, staring at screens, scrolling through wars, numbed by noise and waiting for the thing that feels like a tipping point but might just be the new baseline. Coming up next, our final reflection and call to action. Because even if we can't stop what's begun, we still have choices in how we respond. Let's bring this home. So now we arrive at the end of the line. Or maybe it's just the beginning of the next one. What if China seizes Taiwan while the Middle East burns? We've walked through the trigger points, the military calculations, the diplomatic wreckage, the economic cascade. We've traced how attention, the world's most finite and fragile resource, can be weaponized, and how global institutions, stretched thin across simultaneous fires, begin to break not with a bang, but with bureaucratic silence. And here's the truth. This scenario doesn't end with a peace deal. It ends with a recalibration of reality. Because what China is testing isn't just the strength of its own military or the weakness of Taiwan. It's testing how long the world can look away while something irreversible happens. What Iran is probing in the Levant isn't just Israeli defenses. It's the West's bandwidth for upholding norms. And what the United States is discovering, painfully, is that superpower status doesn't guarantee superhuman reach. You can't be everywhere at once, and when everything is urgent, nothing is truly prioritized. We are watching, in real time, the slow-motion undoing of a global order built on the assumption that conflict would always be sequential, that crises would be spaced out, that problems would be manageable because they'd arrive politely, one at a time. But the world has changed. The tempo has accelerated. The gloves are off. And yet, even here, there are choices. There's a path where leaders take the Taiwan crisis seriously not just as a military problem, but as a warning flare. Where the Geneva talks become more than a stage show and reframe diplomacy not as weakness, but as a tool of hard-nosed statecraft. Where deterrence is reimagined not as the shadow of force, but as the architecture of consequence. Economic, technological, informational. The road to war may be paved with distraction, but the road back from the brink starts with attention, with coordinated pressure, not performance, with leadership that sees the global picture, not just the local scorecard, and with publics that demand it. So as we close, ask yourself, what if we don't get a third warning? What if the distractions don't stop? What if Taiwan is swallowed under the cover of Gaza, and Gaza is forgotten under the weight of Taipei? Then the question isn't what if, but what now? Thanks for listening to What If Horizons. If this episode resonated with you, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who still believes global order is worth protecting. And join us next time when we ask, what if global food prices explode amid war and climate shocks? Because sometimes the biggest crises don't come from bombs, but from bread. Until then, stay alert, stay informed, and stay curious.